welcome everybody to this evening's presentation on behalf of the Art Deco Society UK. My name is Kevin Trickett and I'm the regional representative for Yorkshire and Humber, and also temporarily at least for the northeast of England. It's my great pleasure this evening to bring you I think what's going to be a really fascinating presentation by our guest speaker, Lizzie Glithero-West. Now, Lizzie's talk is entitled Tutankhartier, Death, Rebirth and Decoration in 1920s Tutmania. For many people, I think the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb is thought of as being sort of the beginning, really, of the Art Deco craze, when all the colours that were discovered in Tutankhamun's tomb were brought out into the real world, if you like, and jewelers and designers and artists started to use those colours in their designs. A little bit about Lizzie. Lizzie is the Chief Executive of the Heritage Alliance. She's got a background in the civil service, but her passion is heritage. And there is a link in the chat, which I've already loaded. One's about how you can join the Art Deco Society, but beyond that, there's another one which gives you a bit of biographical detail on Lizzie, and have a look at that at some point. Right, before we get into the talk, I need to do some house rules. So just bear with me. I want to point out, first of all, that we can't see you if you're at home. You should be able to see myself and Lizzie on screen at the moment, but we can't see you, nor can we hear you. So if you want to ask any questions or make any comments on the presentation, please use the Q&A facility at the bottom of the screen and type in your question, and we'll pick those up at the end. Also, I've enabled closed captions or subtitles. So if you click on the CC button, you'll be able to see an approximate representation in writing of what the speakers are saying. I've discovered many times in the past it doesn't cope very well with my Yorkshire accent, so it's not necessarily an accurate reflection of what I just said. Right, I think that's all for now, so let's crack on with what you're all here for. I'll introduce Lizzie. Lizzie, welcome to the Art Deco Society UK. I'm going to hand the floor, the speaker, the microphone, the screen to you, and you can crack on. We expect you to talk about 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll do the Q&A at the end of that. So if everybody's happy, sitting comfortably, Lizzie, the floor is yours.
Lovely, and thanks for having me. And I'm also just about a Yorkshire lass, so apologies if my closed captions also translate slightly strangely. Also recovering from cold, so I will try not to cough during this, but apologies if I do in advance. Okay. I'm just going to try and share my screen and just check that it can be seen on the other side.
You see your screen?
Lovely. And can you see a full screen there? Okay.
Yeah. People can adjust their own settings to speaker view. That would probably give them the best view. But yeah, I can see your screen clearly, and I'm going to switch my camera and microphone off now, so I don't interrupt you.
Wonderful. Well, it's a real pleasure to join you all this evening. This lecture I'd given in a similar form before, actually, as part of an Egyptian revival study day, and it's a bit of an interesting topic that I first fell in love with back when I was doing a master's. And I think what's so fascinating about this topic, and I hope you agree, is that the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun was happening at a really interesting and actually quite challenging time in history, that it coincided with the aftermath of World War I and some of the things that society was having to cope with in that aftermath. But also it was a real opportunity to look at some amazing, colourful, really beautiful Art Deco designs. So I hope you enjoy this topic as much as I enjoyed researching it as well. So I'm just going to flick on through, and if Kevin, you could just let me know that my slides are moving, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, yes, that's
lovely.
Lizzie, yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to start with a bit of introduction to the topic and the period. So on November the 26th, 1922, so almost exactly 100 years ago, we just had the centenary, actually, of much of the excitement around 100 years on from the discovery. So November 26th, 1922, when Howard Carter first glimpsed such wonderful things, as he wrote afterwards, in fact, little could he have truly imagined how quickly they would become endowed with meaning for an unprecedentedly large public. Whether the inhabitants of Paris, London, and New York saw an archaeological triumph, a commercial opportunity perhaps, or a frightening spiritual world, what seems most apparent is that a society recovering from World War I looked hopefully into the face of Tutankhamun and saw themselves. The tomb was very much a time capsule, both a frozen funerary assemblage and a treasure trove of ancient decorative art. It was therefore, I think, no accident that the greatest impact to such a visually rich assemblage was on fashion and jewellery. But the consequent Tutmania, which took the world by storm, was by no means purely an aesthetic craze. I explore in this lecture how the discovery of a young boy lying amidst the remains of his funeral and resurrected after 3,000 years of obscurity tapped into deeper preoccupations of the time. Here was a society trying to attribute meaning to the loss of so many of its young at war and looking for the means to revive itself, emotionally, socially, and definitely economically. A writer and researcher, Eliot, has argued that the Egyptian revival artifact of the 20s should be treated with and credited with as much cultural resonance as Le Corbusier's white rippling walls, but as yet it hasn't. It's often been met by aesthetic snobbery. Analysis of why the impact of the discovery on the arts was so profound is therefore quite scant. And so 15 years ago, I took this challenge for the area of popular culture which most directly relates to the particular flavour of Tutankhamun's tomb, jewellery and accessories. Just so you know, my cat is very interested in the topic and trying to break in. So the howling you hear in the background is a 17-year-old black cat. One jeweller stands out in this area. And so Cartier was not only one of the most innovative and insightful firms of the day, and I don't know whether you've had lectures on Cartier before, but I think they're absolutely fascinating as a jeweller to be looking at, because their deep understanding of Egyptian symbolism was really used to infuse meaning into beautifully crafted items that reflected the identity and the concerns of their wearers. And in the second part of this talk, I'm going to use 3 specific items that they created to explore the appropriation of Egypt in the 1920s as a metaphor for a society in recovery. Finds the way that we perceive ourselves in our environment than through the objects that we value. As people seek to understand death and change, they redefine themselves as individuals and groups whilst leaving material traces in the objects that they produce. Van Gennep proposed a universal tripartite structure in rites of passage such as death, beginning with a separation, a transition through a liminal phase where dead and the mourners alike are, as he put it, betwixt and between normal social roles, and finally ending with social reaggregation. And this liminal period is often characterized by changes in dress and behavior, spiritual searching and distortions of social norms of the time. And the 1920s can be seen as such a period where bereavement became a universal experience and the dead continued to coexist with the living in a number of ways. Sexual and familial relationships were renegotiated during this time, social structures were redefined, and all this was reflected in art, design, and radical fashions. I'm just going to let my cat in because she'll be quiet if I do. So bear with me. So I think what's really fascinating is that, as I say, some of these relationships were renegotiated and were reflected in a range of designs. But also we see the cinema and the dance hall as mass activities being born during this period, servicing a need for escapism. And we also see mass-produced goods that were distracting consumers and seducing them with ideas of luxury. And we see the development of a culture which hides the experience of death and deals with it in other ways through objects, memorials, and spiritual exploration. This was not, I believe, a reaggregated society after the war, but one that was in this transitional limbo. And what better outlet for this grief restrained than through the appropriation of this symbolism of a culture best known for its belief in life eternal? It was therefore with impeccable timing that a symbolic figure representing the dead and feeding the desires of the living was reborn. So most simply, Tutankhamun fulfilled the public desire for entertainment and novelty. But to the grieving, he must have been strikingly reminiscent of the young men of the war who were lost by many families. For those still waiting for news, it was a tale of reward for perseverance. Just as the world had hoped for news of their loved ones, they now waited with bated breath for 2 years to see if Tutankhamun was indeed to be found within his sarcophagus. The war had dulled the romance of death, and the Victorian idea of mourning had to shift and change over this time, given the scale of the loss. Corpses had been used to patch up the sides of trenches, graves had been robbed, and we even have records of games being played with bones. But here, human and ancient care and sentiment was reaffirmed as Tutankhamun was discovered, surrounded by flowers and golden tributes. Tutankhamun had only been preserved because his grave had been covered and forgotten. For families in limbo, this fact must have provided some comfort. He was also the last of his line, and many mourning parents also had no one to carry on their family name. So the figure of Tut, as he became affectionately named, became a global inheritance, a universal child. And just as cenotaphs had provided a channel for grief, Tutankhamun allowed society to meditate on a safe personification of death and, importantly, rebirth, to which they could relate. And the media was really canny. They clearly understood the layers of symbolism. A headline in the New York Times observed that the objects reminded one, I quote, of the casualties being brought out of the trenches. And as you can see in this illustrated London News front page, the sketches of the time that were used in this illustrated newspaper really dwell on that idea of a body being removed and carried on a stretcher with care. And I think you can even see some flowers there on the top of the particular stretcher. Now, this was quite a bit before the actual sarcophagus was even found, and definitely before it was examined. As I say, that was 2 years, but the news was scrabbling to try and show images of what was actually being kept quite tight to a tight group of people within the valley at that particular point. But I think also people looked at Tutankhamun and they not only saw their dead, they saw themselves. Tutankhamun was wrote about and sold as a 1920s man, a man of fashion, a loving husband and an enjoyer of life. And Tutankhamun's wife, Ankhesenamun, not only embodied a modern widow, as well as an ancient widow, but also a spirit of feminine strength. She didn't despair. She set out to find a new husband and tried to continue her dynasty. So soon Tutankhamun as commodity took form following on from this. The discovery had something for everyone. And now it could be owned and translated into popular culture and design so that everyone could have a piece of this excitement and also show that they were culturally aware by owning items. And Pope Pius XII insightfully commented in relation to the news around the discovery, "It is not an exhumation, it is a resurrection." So as we know, an interest in Egyptian revival design was not new. In post-war Paris, previous interest in Orientalism was declared taboo. But ancient Egypt was a little bit different. Instead of representing barbarism or some sort of other, it represented the origin to these Western societies of order and civilization. In January 1919, the Egyptian galleries reopened in the Louvre, so this was before the discovery of the tomb. And at the time, Bizier observed that many of today's painters have entered it with a new heart, with a desire to meet some of the great works there and with a secret hope of finding in them a lesson and a justification. Designers still created Egypt in their own image, but in this acceptable form of Orientalism, they not only produced manifestations of luxury and of fantasy, but also stability and eternity, so important in wartime reconstruction. When Tutankhamun hit the headlines, therefore, the explosion of interest coincided with a crest of pre-existing taste for things Egyptian. And actually, I've done other talks on this, but this goes all the way back to the Regency period, through the Victorian period, and so existed for well over 100 years before the discovery. And many of the pieces that Howard Carter uncovered struck him as, he quoted, extraordinarily modern looking. And I think this is because there was already a craze. And in the absence of accurate information about Tutankhamun and the fact that it took a long time to unpack certain elements in the tomb, designers actually constructed their own ideas about what was in the tomb. The New York Times observed on February the 8th, 1923, that museums were crowded with designers. Carter's descriptions of artifacts almost read like a fashion magazine. And these items could easily be adopted and adapted for the modern day. And I think it's really interesting that Howard Carter actually he wrote in a popular way, and he worked with writers. And he wasn't writing just like I suppose, an archaeologist who was writing for a technical audience. I think he was really aware of the fact that these details would provide inspiration, and he wanted to write in a way that people would want to buy his books and would want to read this as in a popular way. Sorry, 2 slides skipped on there. So you don't need to see this diagram closely. It's more to give you a bit of a sense of some of the research work that I did around the time when I was looking at different Egyptian revival artifacts and objects that were emerging in the 1920s and into the 30s. So Tutmania appears to have progressed in 3 overlapping waves, which are captured in this diagram. So firstly, we see Egyptian designs emerge really quickly through dress and popular entertainment. And then secondly, through jewellery and the decorative arts. So I think we're seeing, in fact, it was 1923 only, really, that we see all over the pages of Vogue, and we see dress and designs for a very limited period being worn, and I'm going to cover that a little bit more. And then I think from 1923 into 24, we see this moving through into jewellery design and the decorative arts. And then finally, we see Egyptian designs emerging through architecture. And that takes a little bit longer, inevitably, given the fact that designs can take a lot longer within that particular sphere anyway. And I think within each of these categories, expression follows a general trend of development from really specific images, kind of copies of things that were photographed or sketched from the tomb itself, but then through to a use of more generic symbols, designs. We talked about right at the beginning, colours that came from the inspiration in the tomb. And then I'd say ultimately, we still see Egypt in the abstract forms and the various shapes and colours and styles that move through into the 1930s. So during 1923, the first wave of interest was its most direct and explicit. So people danced a dance called the Tutankhamun rag. It was seriously proposed that an underground extension in London should be called Tutankhamden. And Ushabti dolls, the little characters that were often found in Egyptian tombs that represented the servants that would be able to mysteriously come alive and serve the dead, were replicated and jostled for space in High Street with replica tomb ornaments and furniture that were direct copies of those which were photographed in the tomb. And as I mentioned, the initial impact straight away was most explosive in fashion. So from February to August 1923, Egypt dominated the pages of Vogue. So I've spent a lot of happy hours looking at Vogue Britain, Vogue London, in the British Library archives. But this was equally dominant in Vogue in New York, and also some of the Parisian fashion magazines as well. We've got La Vie Parisienne here on the screen, and other examples of high fashion at that particular time. So people could buy items called a Tutankhamun hat, a mummy wrap, a Luxora frock, a Tutankhamun overblouse, and they could wear sandals inspired by those in the tomb. And a continued fad for bobbed hair was also attributed to Egypt at this time. And this obsession was so prevalent that it was satirized in the pages of Punch and La Vie Parisienne and other caricatures of the day. research in London Vogue reveals that by late 1923, the fad had already begun to burn out. But we do see this Egyptian revival continuing through abstract patterns, colours, shapes, and actually through the 1920s view of beauty, the slender woman, and through makeup. And then next, in late December 1923, we start to see Vogue announcing a renaissance of pharaonic furniture. Some people collected Napoleonic originals from 100 years previous, 120 years before. And elsewhere, faithful replicas of thrones and couches from the tomb appeared and were even bought by the Carnarvon family, who, of course, were the family that funded the discovery of the tomb initially. Carlton Ware and Wedgwood produced revival ceramics, and Tiffany adapted Egyptian motifs to dressing table sets. I particularly love this Shiraz mantle clock, which is very much in the shape of an Egyptian hairstyle and reminiscent of the 20s bob. And then, as dress had previously, the decorative arts gradually began to shed these specific motifs in favour of Egyptian-inspired forms and colours, which is very much what this clock is adapting. It looks Egyptian, it's an Egyptian shape, but unlike some of the Carlton Ware or some of the Tiffany dressing table sets, which have very specific forms and copied motifs, it's more of an idea or a shape of something. So we start to see Egyptian forms and colours like sunbursts, lotuses, ziggurats, and triangles continuing to make a reference to Egypt, but in a more abstract form. And finally, there's so many wonderful examples here, and I'm only going to canter through a few. But we see Egyptian revival architecture following suit from about 1927. It was particularly used in factories, cinemas, and ships. Egypt provided economical advertising, embodied a number of spatial and aesthetic ideals, and allowed architects to literally construct temples of commerce. However, deeper analysis reveals that although at times these Egyptianizing artifacts may have been created for commercial reasons, many of them display a preoccupation with questions of life and death. And I'm now going to spend a little bit more time drilling in depth into a lens through which I think we can get a real sense of some of these symbols and some of the ideas at the time, as I mentioned earlier, Cartier's jewellery. And Tutankhamun as a personification of rebirth is, I think, most vividly expressed when it's mapped onto the objects that people really chose as their closest identifiers and most highly prized possessions, their jewellery. Edward VII described Cartier as, I quote, the jeweller of kings as well as the king of jewellers. Cartier represented tradition and luxury, but also creativity and innovation. They shaped the tastes of a society who followed their fashionable lead. An academic, Bonanno, describes the 20s as a great epoch of the master jeweller, and Cartier's work, particularly under the creative leadership of Louis Cartier, who was based in Paris, provided a perfect meshing of the artistic spirit of the times with an obsession with Egypt. In this, I think Cartier was unique for a number of reasons. Firstly, Louis Cartier really had his finger on the pulse of fashion and was really intuitive of society's desires and anticipated them really well. And secondly, Cartier's designs were genuinely interesting and genuinely original. And finally, Cartier's designers were grounded in a really coherent philosophy on the interplay between taste, object, and meaning. And the three brothers who ran the firm at the time were themselves collectors of Egyptian antiquities, and they had studied them in depth. So when it came to Egyptian revival styles, their objects were rooted in the knowledge of Egyptian culture and belief. Young designers were personally tutored by the Cartier brothers from their large libraries of design books and collections of antiques. Louis Cartier constantly encouraged his draftsmen to wander through Paris to note down details of architecture. And designer Charles Jacquot, who worked for the firm, was fond of prowling the Louvre with his sketchbook. And Cartier strove to transform and somehow refract historic material through the prism of their own outlook. I particularly love this set of designs. This is just some examples, but these come from Owen Jones's Grammar of Ornament, which were published in the late Victorian period. But you can really see, and I think you'll see in some of the images that I show later, that some of these designs are very much replicated in some of the designs that Cartier used later on. And in turn, in fact, these designs were influenced by some Regency period designs and some of the things that were coming to London, coming to the British Museum, coming through the discovery of tombs like Seti I and Belzoni's exhibition, and the scene in some of the tombs and the designs that were very prevalent as well in that Victorian period. So we're definitely part of a continuum of design and colour and styles, and particularly not logos, but particular designs and styles and shapes that would have been actually part of popular design vocabulary at the time. And there are two main types of Cartier's Egyptian creations. And I'd say we see them in about three different manifestations. So the three manifestations would be jewellery, accessories, and clocks. Cartier created a lot of clocks. And the first was the longest lived, from 1913 to the 1930s. And these are designs by Cartier constructed from modern materials, often very rich and expensive materials, but modern. But the second group, which I find the most fascinating, which dates from 1923, so after the tomb's discovery, combined Egyptian themes and motifs with authentic, real ancient artifacts that were acquired from Parisian dealers. And these pieces are unique because they were ancient and really important in what Cartier did with them. So two academics, Silva and Diaz, have suggested that these exotic and sometimes bizarre inventions from Cartier were much more than mere personal adornment, because they encapsulated a part of the culture that inspired them, with all its symbolic and talismanic qualities. So Louis Cartier believed that he was doing something new for the objects themselves, literally providing a resurrection for those artifacts, rather than just creating something fresh using an Egyptian style. And I think it's therefore no surprise that some of Cartier's regular clients were also collectors who understood their genius. And these creations were unique, I think. I've not found anything quite like it, actually, in Art Deco jewellery. And for this reason, they stand apart from the range of other themed items in competition. There were other jewellers who were creating really expensive items, Egyptian themed items, but there were none like this. So Louis Cartier, I think, understood society, really knew Egypt, and was willing to experiment, making the firm such an enlightening case study. So I'm going to look at three particular case studies of these wonderful original artifacts. So beginning in 1923, Cartier London in particular began to produce a series of winged scarab brooches, such as these respectively from 1924 and 1925. So these either contained an ancient scarab, as we see at the bottom there, with modern jewelled wings, or a modern scarab, as we see at the top there, set with ancient blue faience wings. Cartier was able to contrast the opacity of some materials with the glitter of others to create unique designs. Now, scarabs had been popular in jewellery since the mid-19th century, and Cartier had been producing variations on this theme actually since 1852. So the rootedness of the ancient elements, combined with what were familiar motifs to people, must have appealed to an English audience who were somewhat nervous of the hard chic, I quote, of French decorative jewellery. And Carnarvon himself had said in 1921 that when beauty and historic interest are blended in a single object, the interest and the delight of possession of these objects are more than doubled. And Cartier also seemed to have strongly believed in this philosophy. Common protective amulets in Egypt. They represented the god Khepri, the self-created god, and the guarantor of resurrection and immortality. And as the heart was central to eternal life in most New Kingdom burials, it's protected by a winged scarab in the wrappings on the chest. There'd been a number of significant jewellery collections, cachets found, and the symbolism of certain motifs and colours was very much already in the vocabulary of designers, I don't think they used these symbols lightly. I think they understood and they thought about the symbols that they were using. And it's really interesting to look at some of the trade magazines at the time. So I spent a little bit of time looking at the Jeweller's Circular, which was the jewelry professions magazine at the time. And you see in there real debates over the use of certain symbols. So one article that I found states, and I'll just quote this because it's fascinating. Some declare that the open-winged scarab represents death, but its Egyptian name means creator, never death. Some say the jeweller should refrain from using that scarab form. The writer, in the Jeweller's Circular, differs totally from this view and would recommend its use even as signifying a sombre fact that we must all face. So that was written in the aftermath of the war, and I think is just really fascinating source from the time about how much some of these designers thought about what these symbols might have meant and what they could be talking about to a society of the time. And I think this enlightening contemporary source really highlights the crux of my argument here, namely that people sometimes chosen to wear the scarab because they wanted to remember their dead and reflect on a contemporary issue. And in resurrecting these ancient scarabs from the tombs of the dead, Cartier, I believe, tapped into their sublime beauty to give them a new meaning and purpose in resurrecting the hearts of the women that they now adorned. So beyond the individual, there's a second really interesting case study looking at the vanity case of the time. So Cartier's work, I think, is really enlightening also about the rebirth of society as a whole, and in particular, a reconfiguration of gender roles during the 1920s and beyond. So I've already mentioned that changing fashions such as short hair, bare arms, more revealing clothing at the time gave jewellery new freedoms, and women became bolder in their tastes and more mobile in their leisure pursuits. The industry was reinvigorated. The scarab jewellery, in fact, became a metaphor for its own craft. And a radical change affecting the jeweller was the increased adoption during the time of makeup and also smoking in women. Cosmetics became a flourishing business, and both henna and kohl were swiftly readopted. Ancient cosmetics, connected with the mortician's art of beautifying corpses, are paradoxically translated into an emblem of new life for the 1920s woman. We find in the Egyptian assemblages, and particularly in the tomb of Tutankharmun, we find mascaras, kohls, we find pots of makeup, we find oils and unguents, and you can see in the British Museum now, not from Tutankhamun's tomb, but beautiful pots that would have contained makeup that would have been highly prized and left for eternity in some of these tombs. Small vanity case, some of these are just fantastic to look at. The V&A has a wonderful collection actually of these vanity and cigarette cases from the period from the 1920s into the 30s, and a number of these are Egyptian revival in style. So I think the portable vanity case, or nécessaire as they called it in Paris, became a symbol of the age. And Cartier's Egyptian interpretations of the genre brought with them a lot of fascinating references around death and rebirth. And you can see on some of these images where some of them are original and are using contemporary materials here. So you can see the top one there is modern materials with an Egyptian symbolism, but you see on the other two that there are ancient artifacts there incorporated into the front of these particular cases. So this is a particularly good and fabulous example with so much symbolism in it. So this is from 1923. And this is Cartier's Parisian-based Lefebvre, a designer for the firm, designed this vanity case in the form of a sarcophagus. So an Egyptian coffin, essentially, and you can see that in the shape and the curved top on this particular case, and you can see an original artifact incorporated into that top case of it as well. And this was purchased by a Mrs. George Blumenthal, a leader of New York fashion. The piece was layered with, as I mentioned, complex symbolism around youth and beauty, femininity, and eternal life. So as I mentioned, the antique lid is Persian ivory, and it depicts a young girl amongst lotus flowers. The base continues with this theme, with female offering bearers surrounded by ibises and lotus stems. And the sides are equally bursting with resurrection symbolism. And you can see here, I won't flick back at this particular point, but this is really a design very similar or almost identical to one of those Owen John designs that I showed earlier from some of the pattern books that would have been available at the time. And this resurrection symbolism that we can see has lotus flowers, which is a symbol of rebirth, daisies and grapes. And Cartier's use of colour here is also really interesting and betrays, I think, a deep understanding of the magical significance of colour in ancient Egypt. Osiris, the god of the dead, was usually depicted with green flesh, as shown here on the Sphinx-like Tutankharmun on the end of the case. And if you go into the British Museum and if you go into a Manchester Museum and some of the other great collections of Egyptian art, you can see sarcophagi and tombs there, sorry, not tombs, the coffins from the tombs there that often showed Egyptian faces with green skin, again, a symbol of rebirth. And the vanity case as an emblem of social renewal, I think, gives a number of really interesting contrasting ideas about the emancipation of women at the time. The image here that you can see on the screen is some of the sketches that were produced when the case was being designed, and the design on the bottom. So you can see the symbolism on all sides of that particular case. So I think this Cartier sarcophagus provides a reminder that feminine adornment was rooted in antiquity, and cosmetic boxes like Cartier's were discovered in the tomb. Cleopatra and Nefertiti, the ancient paradigms of mystery and beauty already understood by society, were then used to advertise female products. And now every woman could attract men, as Cleopatra had ensnared Antony, and survive like Nefertiti had. And the vanity case translated the woman into commodity as well. Luxury firms such as Cartier played a significant role in the rebirth of Paris and Paris's commerce and its economy after the war. One of the academic Art Deco academics, actually, that I studied with a few years ago, called Tag Gromberg, argues that the female body was transformed into a spectacle of luxury during this period, which itself represented the feminized city of Paris, which it decorated. And alongside A New Freedom, there was also a debate in France about a woman's proper role and a social policy that was brought in at the time that linked motherhood to national security. So we're getting some real contrasting themes. You're getting women who had more freedom as a result of the war. You're getting more experimentation by certain women with what they wore, what they did, etc. But you also get a reinforcing of the idea of the family. So many men died in the war that the idea of a mother and a mother's role was also really important during this time. So perhaps here we also see the art of Tutankhamun's reign giving another parallel, that of a beautiful yet dutiful wife and mother here in Nkesinamun. And the obvious flip side of liberating feminine adornment is the possession implied by expensive jewellery. A bejewelled woman becomes, in some cases, the decoration for the male and the showcase of his wealth and power. And then finally, I wanted to cover a third example and case study that is particularly fascinating, produced by Cartier. So this is a little bit later. So we're looking at 1927 now. And this is the Temple Gate clock. And a famous horologist, Maurice Coué, worked with Cartier and created this clock for Cartier Paris. And it takes the form of an Egyptian temple gate. It's not a copy of the image to the right, but it gives an idea of the sorts of shapes that were well known in Egyptian architecture, in tomb design, and in the kind of more iconic images that would have come out of Egypt in the shapes of some of those large temples that would have been around for at least 100 years and beyond in some of the literature that came out of Egypt. And I think this is a really sophisticated incarnation of a set of really subtle ideas about eternity. So we'll take a little look at this clock. So an academic, Elliot, that I mentioned earlier, identified 5 key attributes of 1920s Egyptian revival objects. And I think all of these are evident in this sophisticated clock. So the first is framing devices. The second is the piling up of artifacts with motifs. The third is a richness of iconography, so images and materials. A developing narrative is the fourth, so something that tells a story, and an overlaid sense of both past and present. So looking at this clock, if you look at the lintel, so the top section first, it depicts a stylized version of the goddess Mut, who shielded her devotees from famine and from pestilence. And this placement, which is not used in Egyptian pylons, must have therefore been intentional. The clock face, as you can see in the middle, is framed, if you look really closely, with coral papyrus stems. So the little orange lines have got sections at the top, and they are papyrus, which represent time past in ancient Egypt. The gold and radium hands of the clock, they take a form of an open lotus flower, as you've got a bud and then an open lotus. And these represent time present, and then the open one being time to come. I think that's really clever design. And in ancient Egypt, coral, so the material itself, was believed to have protective properties. Gold was the flesh of the gods. Lapis lazuli, so that's the gorgeous blue colour that you see at the top and the bottom, signified joy and delight, and also the protective night sky. And finally, above the plinth, we see, so this is in the bottom section below the hands of the clock, we see a frieze, and this depicts a pharaoh making an offering to the river of life. On the back of the case, I haven't got this on this particular image, but there's a concealed panel which drops an invisible hinge, revealing a winding mechanism. And when Christie's auctioned this clock, they described the design as reminiscent of the secret openings in Egyptian tombs. So many layers of interesting symbolism here. And I think this clock, therefore, becomes just a really interesting paradigm or metaphor for the entire age that we're looking at. For Cartier, for its American owners, and for the future of the West. Time was essential to Cartier. Louis in particular had a real talent for predicting social change, which ensured the success of Cartier during this period. And a writer, Rawlet, suggests that the people of the 20s were equally obsessed with the passing of time. Time had been necessary to recover from the war. Time to bury, time to heal, and importantly, time to recover. And as the Janus head of the West looked back into the origins of civilization to root itself, and to get a sense of ancientness and bring that into its future, and to pre-war days for memories of those who had died, it also looked ahead to the hope of a prosperous future, so important in recovery of society at this time. And countries really began to look into their own past for future inspiration. The general strike of 1926 in England may have hinted at the impending end to some of this frivolity, and society must have wondered what was next and longed for the protection and a promise of stability. The clock also suggests future possibilities for Americans such as the Blumenthals who owned it. These families needed to create both an inheritance but also an image for their families in a way that old moneyed families did not. And what better symbolism for these new generations and new dynasties than rooting these ideas in Egypt? They just needed time. So by now, as I mentioned at the beginning, we see the complex symbolic language of Egypt being kind of really knowable and comprehensible to a knowing and an educated audience. Of course, not everybody would have understood this symbolism, but those who would have commissioned or bought this work, I think, would have had a pretty reasonable idea of where some of these influences came from. It had been in newspapers, it was in magazines. You know, the advertising over this period was so clear in its Egyptian influences that it was just part of dialogue. It was part of people's knowledge in the time. And so some of those overt Egyptian references that we saw in the clock that I just showed you represented one of the last of its kind. And Cartier had started and already begun during that period to produce really sophisticated pieces based on Egyptian colours, combinations and shapes rather than images. So we see in these cigarette cases produced from 1930, for example, combinations of lapis lazuli and turquoise and gold. They were striking and they were modern, but they could still subtly symbolize divinity and delight and echo Egypt in their style. And I think the clock and some of the colours used in those cases also draw really interesting parallels with the last of the mediums of Egyptian revival in the 1920s and into the beginning of the 30s, architecture. The message of Egypt became longevity and a static self-assurance. Wallace's much mourned temple-like Firestone factory in West London, this was destroyed overnight. And in my day job, looking at the preservation of heritage and the importance of being able to list buildings that matter and be able to consult before decisions are made about their future. This was literally bulldozed over a weekend and is much mourned, I think, by Art Deco enthusiasts and Egyptian revival scholars alike. This was in West London, and I think it particularly echoes the clock symbolism with some of the colours and the designs that we can see around the facade and the doorway. By 1927, the preoccupations of society are really quite different than they were in 1922. There was a lot more time between the war and the late 20s. And I think people couldn't have fully recovered. Many families had been touched by the war, but I think they became more distant from it. And so artistic symbolism referenced resurrection, perhaps without some of the morbid associations of the grave. And whether this signified a society in recovery or in fact one plunging further into denial is really difficult to conclude. But Egypt as a motif of eternity still continues today and actually re-emerges often with either any time that the Tutankhamun artifacts tour. We see it with references to particular discoveries beyond this point, and also fashion designers just regularly reinterpret Egypt, often associated with film or with particular moments of publication. We see it with Cleopatra, we see it with some of the kind of iconic films, even ones such as The Mummy that would hit the blockbusters today. And so in 1991, the Temple Gate clock, I popped it back up here again, it was purchased at auction in Christie's, New York for a whopping $1.5 million, which according to Forbes made it the most expensive clock in the world at that time. So the appeal clearly still continues. And in Ulysses, a book by Joyce published in 1922, Joyce imagines a graveyard fitted with recording machines so that the bereaved might hear the voices of their loved ones. Today, society's desire for preservation continues as we continue to mummify ourselves in our ideal form through film, through photography, and increasingly through social media. Interest in Tutankhamun resurges, as I mentioned, every major exhibition and every time we create new modern personalities for him and represent him in the arts through the lens of our own preoccupations at the time. The Egyptian revival is far from a passing fad or a purely aesthetic trend. It is genuinely a recurring theme in the history of taste, and the insight that it reveals into any period that felt its deep resonance is an essential and I think still much overlooked area of art history. So I think more needs to be done, and I really hope that that's created an interest for those of you who may not have thought about it to date, so that you can look into some of these wonderful objects yourself as well. I'm just going to stop sharing at that point. Just bear with me.
Thank you, Lizzie.
Hoping it's coming down from the screen. I think it's just got a lag.
We can still see your slides.
You can still see my slides.
Yeah.
Here we go. There we are.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Right. Well, look, that was a wonderful presentation, a lot there to think about. And while I encourage people at home to start asking their questions by typing them in the Q&A, just 1 or 2 comments from myself. First of all, as predicted, the captions didn't cope particularly well with Tutankhamun and other phrases.
I'm sure. Some of the French names.
I did at one point see Tutankharmen. Well, a new opera there in the making.
Well, possibly like the Tutankhamden that was mooted for the underground, which is just incredible, isn't it? Really, that in a contemporary source at the time, that was genuinely thought about, and obviously the plays on the name were prevalent during the period, so it's appropriate.
Yeah, I suppose it is. Yes. Listening to these webinars, which is something that really took off during lockdown, has exposed viewers at home to so many ideas, and something you came up with, at the beginning of your presentation was something I never considered before, and this was the fact that people emerging from World War One, still sort of grieving their losses, would look at how objects were being extracted from the tombs and see them sort of as the casualties being lifted from the trenches. You talked about resurrection of artifacts, resurrection of Tutankhamun, resurrection of beauty. This is a way of looking at this that I'd never previously gotten. I thought I knew a lot about Art Deco, but I recognise there's lots that I don't know. So that was particularly insightful, I thought.
Thank you. And it's really fascinating, that actually I'm an anthropologist and an archaeologist, and then went to study art history. And I think I like making connections and actually really open to questioning on this. Like, we don't have all the answers. We can't definitely say, that Cartier made particular choices. What we can go off is just the contemporary sources. But it's fascinating. They were the words used at the time. The newspapers were playing on this. The Pope talked about resurrection. It's just fascinating, isn't it, that that connection was being made, because it was very much in people's minds at the time. Yeah.
I remember going back to my school days, when you were given a poem to read and you had to try to explain to your English teacher what the poet had in mind. And unless the poet had written it down, how on earth do we know? And I've written 1 or 2 poems, and I've always made it very clear there are no hidden meanings in my poems. They're just words that rhyme and have a nice to do.
And the irony with Tutankhamun as well, I didn't cover it so much here, but Egyptologists who I would normally talk to about this particular topic would know that Tutankhamun, he's the only one that we've discovered a full assemblage at this height, but he was a really minor pharaoh. He was in a repurposed tomb. It would have been a lot smaller than the other ones from the time. And actually, ironically, the only reason that this assemblage survived from this young, unimportant pharaoh is because actually his tomb was covered by the spoil heaps of later, more important pharaohs. And I think there's something really comforting about the fact that, for a grave that hadn't been found, for a family back in England, say, waiting to hear whether, their young person had been found, whether their young person was the one unknown soldier in the cenotaph, actually a grave that hadn't been found probably meant it was a grave that hadn't been disturbed as well. And I think there's all these really interesting resonances about the fact that it could have been a symbol of hope as well as care in that time.
We've got a question here. I mean, this idea that finds from the tombs could so influence Western culture. One of the questions is, do we know what the Egyptians thought of how this influence had been extrapolated across Europe and the USA?
Yeah, so I would love to kind of expand at some point the talk that I've given, and I have to just kind of make no apology about the fact that it is focused very much on Paris, London and New York, because that was the kind of particular study of these designs. But there's a lot of increasing thinking about, of course, the fact that this influenced thinking in Egypt as well. And of course, there are a lot of very complex themes going on at the time. Egypt was during this period, and in fact, it was during the period that the tomb was being discovered, that Egypt was becoming more independent, that there were new rules about the fact that if you excavated, the finds had to stay in Egypt, which really threw Carnarvon, because before finds had been really divided and you could pay yourself back for the funding that you would have had to have put into this sort of excavation. And that didn't happen. And that's why many of those artifacts are still in Egypt. And so all of these themes very much are intertwined with the history of Egypt, thinking about itself as well, its own past, and really reinventing its own future. So I think there's a lot of influence in Egyptian thinking over this period. But there's also those themes, of course, aren't there, of appropriation and the West kind of taking some of these symbols. And actually, I think we think in a much more nuanced way, don't we, about some of the symbols that we might be using from ancient or modern cultures now. And there's a lot of scholarship thinking about this. So yes, we do have a lot of studies out there on what the Egyptians thought about that influence. And of course, some of it is a little less tasteful, I think, perhaps, when we look at it with modern eyes than might have been the case back in the period when Orientalism was seen to be, you know, something exotic and exciting and something that could be taken and emulated as well.
Yeah, the next question, which just come in, actually, you've been talking from Emma, says, thank you
Oh
so
yeah,
much.
cultural appropriation, yeah.
But thank you so much for fascinating and gorgeous talk, Lizzie. I was wondering what your thoughts were on cultural appropriation, which you've just touched on. As
Yeah.
someone who has an Egyptian revival jewellery and is wondering whether to wear it out. Sadly, though, it's not Cartier.
I think wear it, absolutely wear it. I think, you know, I think people at the time were thinking about what themes meant. You know, this is ancient jewelry. Of course, we don't fully know, and we can't fully know what the ancients thought. I think that I think this jewelry, as we've talked about, you know, it may be stylistic. I have some stuff myself. I think we have to have good conversations about this. But I think these are designs, and if we think about not taking designs from any culture over time, you know, we're influenced by the Greeks, we're influenced by the Romans, we're influenced by so many cultures. We wouldn't be wearing anything, would we? In fact, you know, and actually our architecture, all of our architecture is influenced by the past. So I think we do it in the knowledge of the fact that this is influenced by the past. But I don't think it's disrespectful, because of course this is just so ancient, and shapes and designs, nothing is new, actually. And I think this talk looks at the fact that we're on a constant continuum from ancient times, in that nothing is new. And I think respect for the ancient cultures is important, and increasingly we're thinking about this, but our designs and styles are absolutely always built on something that came before. Oh, do wear it, and I'd love to see the stuff that people have as well. Do share on Twitter. I have a few of my own as well.
And another question, just to clarify what you said on these, but did Cartier actually have access to original objects from the tombs? And if so, how did he acquire them?
So not from the tomb of Tutankhamun, of course. That would have stayed in Egypt. We know that the odd bit was kind of taken and pocketed, perhaps, by some of the excavators. But there had been a good 200-300 years of trafficking and actually legal buying of artifacts as well. So Cartier managed to acquire through Parisian or London auction houses, jewelers, there would have been a regular trade in artifacts. It's only in the last few years that there has been a kind of clampdown of removal of artifacts from Egypt. And so these things were bought and sold. They were sold in Egypt. They were sold sometimes, I would say, you know, fairly nefarious deeds would have actually been done to gather these artifacts in Georgian and Victorian times. We know that tombs were ripped apart to get these amulets, and they were sold within Egypt, etc. So I think there is a recognition of that. But yeah, they were traded, they were bought, they were sold, and there was a real collection going on of things, everything from sarcophagi through to small amulets and items.
Thank you. You mentioned an Art Deco expert you'd studied with or been studying, and the name didn't quite come through. And when I looked at the captions, it suggested I may have misheard. Did you say you'd worked with somebody else to do something called Tag
Bromberg? Yes.
Bromberg.
She writes about the Art Deco period and ideas of femininity and beauty, and the idea Paris kind of reinventing itself during that period and seeing it through that lens. She's a fascinating writer, actually, and really worth looking at.
All right, thank you. Yes, one I've not heard of. We've had a couple of comments from people saying, really great talk. Somebody's had to sign off, unfortunately, so she won't know that I've said that to you, but it's there in the chat if you want to have a look at it. I think we seem to have run out of questions now, so maybe we've certainly run out of time. So I think we'd probably best bring that to an end. But thank you once again, Lizzie. That has been a superb presentation. And as I say, so much to think about that I previously hadn't thought about myself. So I hope this has inspired people to go in and start doing some more research and reading.
There is so much to look at, honestly, and there's kind of so many people who are looking at particular types of jewelry or particular designers. And the next piece of work I'm going to do is delve a bit more into the 1920s Vogue archives, because they're such a rich source, and you can spend a happy day actually just looking through 1923 in the British Library, and they're genuinely fascinating to look at. I do have a chapter in a book. I will tweet about it afterwards if that's useful. There's a compilation of sort of academic, but I would say accessible articles on Egyptian revival, and I've written a part of this talk within one of those chapters as well.
Right. Well, I'm very much into books, so I'll be following you on Twitter. What is your Twitter name, your Twitter handle?
So I am at heritage_Lizzie. And I do share quite a lot of Egyptian revival and Art Deco stuff on there.
Right. Okay. Well, I share your sense of loss over some of the architecture that we have lost in the past, and the need for proper preservation, backed by legislation as well. We've lost too much and continue to lose it.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much again.
Thanks for having me.
Just for me now, forced me now to tell people that we have another talk in November, on Friday the 10th of November. We'll be looking at the Australian Art Deco hotels. So if anybody is interested in that, you can book that through the Art Deco website. I'll put a slide up in a moment to just remind everybody how you can find out about the Art Deco Society. And in the chat, I put, again, more messages about the Art Deco Society as well. So thank you everybody for watching. Thank you, Lizzie. That's been great. That's an hour well invested of everybody's time, I think, listening to that tonight. So thank you, and goodbye, Lizzie.